Hi, I'm Othais, and this is a revolver, as are all of these things in front of me. Specifically, they tend to be centerfire military revolvers from about 1870 through the early 1900s. My access to these pieces is largely because of the nature of our show. Focused on World War I, these are the sort of wheel guns that generally saw service in the Great War. However, we've also started to work our way up from the beginning with our new Percussion series, which started with the Colt Patterson cap and ball revolver. In attempting our usual in-depth episodes, I've done my best to describe the guns accurately, but I have to make a confession. To my knowledge, every single public-facing arms historian is frankly kind of awful at revolver history, and that's including myself. The good news is that I've been working very hard to fix this issue, and I've rather recently found the works of a researcher that I believe I can trust to form a timeline. So going forward, I hope to clarify a lot of the mess we've all been making when we talk about revolvers. In reviewing this material, however, I've realized the general zeitgeist understanding of revolver mechanisms is fairly weak. These days, most of my casual viewers will recognize short recoil versus long recoil versus blowback. They recognize striker fire versus hammer fire. They recognize single and double stack magazines. They understand what a trigger disconnect is and why it is important to the operation of a semi-automatic handgun. But when we talk about revolvers, sure, you might know single versus, say, double action. You might even understand the rebounding of the hammer or half-cock position. But once you start to ask people to sort of picture those sorts of actions and how they differ and hold it in their minds, it gets a little bit fuzzy, doesn't it? Well, this video will hopefully help you sharpen things up and see some details that you might not have noticed before. But first, let's identify what we really mean when we say a revolver for the purposes of this episode. Of these three things, only one is truly a revolver, at least in the context of our show today. This semi-automatic handgun, not a chance. Nothing's revolving here. It's just a tilting barrel. So let's just get that out of the way for a second. Now, this guy right here is actually a two-shot Derringer, which you may confuse for a revolver because it revolves. But each chamber has its own barrel, and our understanding of a revolver for this show is a singular barrel with a revolving magazine. This is just such an arrangement. This is a Dutch officer's model. I get to talk about this some other day, but we have a 6-round magazine in this case, which is a revolving cylinder. And it's kind of hard to call it a magazine because traditionally we tend to think of those as having springs, but that's what it is. It's holding our ammunition, and it revolves, and it's cylindrical in shape, although it doesn't have to be a revolver. This is what we think. Rotating in order to align with a barrel before you fire it. This is what we're talking about today. This K-frame is a bit more modern in construction, or at least more modern revolvers favor it. It's actually been around for a long time, but we can use this as a good way to get our show started by flipping her over. I've already taken her apart a good bit so that we can see inside. And what we find is that a lot of people have lied to me. I was told that revolvers were simpler than automatic pistols. What the heck is all of this? As with anything complicated, I'm going to suggest we break the process of understanding a given revolver action into a series of component parts, grouped not on their immediate association, but rather on their overall function. There will be 7 categories, and Bruno and my buddy Matt helped me work them into a bit of a mnemonic device. How to really study revolving action firearms. Yep, just look for the hammer, trigger, rotation, safety, reloading, assembly, and the feel. If this seems simple, good. I'm going to show you how complex it can get. Let's start with the hammer. This is generally the easiest part of the revolver to understand. Our hammer category is really defined by 2 things though, the striking element and the priming element that it interacts with. They sort of play off of each other. Many other parts may be necessary to get this to actually work. Now, 9 out of 10 revolvers will have an external hammer immediately visible to the user. Some, however, might have a shrouded hammer where only a bit is showing, or even a purely internal hammer totally hidden from sight. Of course, there are always weird exceptions in which, 1 in a million, a striker could be used in a revolver design. But we're actually here for a more nuanced understanding of normal revolvers, so let's go ahead and get our hands dirty and get a look. What I have here is a reproduction Colt Patterson revolver. Now, this percussion cap design used a very simple flat-faced hammer because all it needed to do was strike down on one of 6 of these firing cones that would have been capped with a priming cap, impact reactive component that would then flash the actual black powder inside the chamber, which in turn drives our bullet out of the barrel. Percussion cap would soon be replaced with metallic cartridge ammunition. The first popular options for revolvers in this field would actually be pin-fired. Now, because of the era in which I've been working, I don't actually have any pin-fire revolvers here today. At least not any that are still pin-fired. This Danish revolver was originally adopted in 1865, and from the slots in the cylinder wall, we can see that it was originally set up in order to use pin-fire cartridges, in which we'd have a protrusion sticking out of each of these slots. You can actually see that pin right here. A blow from the hammer drives it into the center of the casing, where it impacts a central primer, setting off the cartridge. Now, this revolver was actually later modified to centerfire, so the hammer was changed, but pin-fire hammers would have had an overhand shape in order to slap those pins in laterally. This little guy is actually a modern rim-fire revolver. The priming compound would have been spun into the hollow rim of the case, and the hammer is designed to pinch on the edge of that cartridge. You can see a cutout. Actually, let's do this. You can see a cutout right here that allows the hammer to hit down onto the rim of the cartridge and therefore crush one little corner of it. And by crushing the rim in that one spot, it would set off the priming compound and then set off the cartridge. Rimfire hammers generally do have this sort of offset on where it strikes, and they also tend to be sort of blunt bladed styles of hammers, although there are, of course, exceptions out there. And finally, we have a centerfire revolver, in this case, an Italian Chamelot-Delvigne, which, ignoring all the fun stuff, we can see that our hammer is just a simple cone that is going to strike at the center of the cartridge. This passes, of course, through the frame in order to get to it, and in this case, you'll see that this is a very big fixed pin. But you may see later designs that are sort of floated, wobbly, pinned-in things that give it some play and allow for easier replacement should they become damaged. Alternatively, this Rost & Gosser is a centerfire gun, but it has a very flat-faced hammer. And the reason for that is because it uses a firing pin that's actually set in the frame. Striking that firing pin in turn strikes the center primer on your centerfire cartridge and therefore sets off the round. Now, it's worth noting that in all these cases, we have not just the hammer, but a bias of the hammer. The hammer always wants to travel forwards. It's always sprung to head towards the percussive element of our particular cartridge. And so we need to take note of hammer springs. In this case, we have a V spring that is powering the hammer, and then it goes on to do other things that we'll talk about in a moment. But the hammer spring is going to be a component of our consideration of the hammer assembly. Really, when we say hammer, what we're thinking of is percussion, the ability to strike the primer in whatever form it takes. There are certainly other methods I don't have here today. This episode is not going to be exhaustive. It's just to show you how many permutations there can be. Now, as simple as our first category was, don't forget we managed to already whip up a number of variations, and we're on step 1. Next category up, though, is the trigger, the component or components that release the hammer to fall. Triggers are a pretty fancy topic. In theory, it could be a switch or a button or anything that manages to hold the hammer back and then let it fly. But a common vein has emerged, at least as far as it interacts with human hands. On my Patterson, I can simply show you that we cock the hammer and then pull the trigger in order to then drop the hammer. Now, if I pull that trigger again, nothing's happening, right? So what my trigger is doing is one operation and one operation only in this consideration. It does other things through some linkages, but in relation to the hammer, all it's doing is releasing it. It does not recock it. It doesn't do anything else fancy. It just releases the hammer. Therefore, this is a single action trigger. Here we have an 1879 Revolver, another single action only revolver. In this case, our trigger interacts directly with the hammer. So there's a couple notches cut in there. We have a little lug on the trigger. And so when I cock this guy all the way back, click, the hammer is held back. And when we pull the trigger, it will drop. I don't want to dry fire that with the side of this off especially, because that can tear up the pins. So if I pull it, you see it's released, and then that means it would fall forward under spring pressure. That, again, is single action. Now, in this Chamelot-Delvigne, the trigger is not directly connected to the hammer. Instead, we have a sear here. Now, this actually serves two purposes, but we're only going to talk about one at the moment, which is that when we go to full cock, watch it very carefully, tick, right? So we've locked in notch to notch, and we're holding our hammer back. You can see that if we pull the trigger, it's going to tip the front of this up, and therefore the bottom of it down as it pivots. That's going to release the hammer. Again, I have to be a little delicate because the plate is off, but as I pull, see that gap open up, and she springs on down and would have discharged it if we had had it assembled and loaded. That, again, is a single action operation, although, as we're going to see again in a moment, there's some other stuff going on in here that gives us some extra options. Now, single action seems pretty straightforward. The trigger does one thing. It only releases the hammer. In the modern context, single actions are largely seen as antiques, cowboy guns. And that's a pretty fair assessment because even back in the percussion cap era, we already started to see double actions become fairly popular. These are revolvers that when you pull the trigger, you both cock, it's going back all its own, and release the hammer. The reason you might want to have either single or double action is because in single action, you've taken up all that spring tension with a deliberate mechanical action, cocking the hammer with your thumb. That means there's almost no pressure on your trigger, and the manufacturer can provide a tiny or lightened engagement of some sort so that the trigger pull is extremely light and easy, making it less likely for you to throw your shot due to unwanted muscle tension further down your arm. Double action is heavier, but works as fast as you can pull that trigger. The Japanese Type 26 revolver I have here is an example of a double action mechanism. Specifically, it's double action only. So I can pull the trigger, it will cock and then release the hammer. But I cannot manually bring that hammer back and have it lock. It just bounces around. I'm not able to get that back for single action. So I cannot just release the hammer. I must cock and release the hammer. Double action. Now, the way it does it is hidden on inside. All right, it's a little deep in there and a little hidden, but what I want you to pay attention to is this little nub in here and this nub in here. This is an extension off the trigger, and this is a separate piece called the nose, which is hinged onto the hammer and powered by a flat spring so that it wants to go forward down the front of the gun, right? If I pull the trigger, it's going to lift on that nose. I'm not using this finger, I'm just supporting it. And eventually it's going to slip past it. And when it does slip past it, that releases the hammer to fall. Let me show you that one more time. Slips past and falls, all right? Now, you may have noticed that on the return stroke of the trigger, we need a way to clear this coming back. So this is biased to work only one way. We can push it back, and yet when the trigger wants to return, the spring inside allows this to compress and then pop back out where it belongs. So watch for that compression on the return stroke. We fire, the hammer drops, and then we'll return our trigger. And look at that flex, 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 flex. Snaps on past, and we're back in business. While the hammer nose is by far the most common method of double action, it was hardly the first. That trophy seems to go to the 1851 Adams revolver, another double action only that used a lever arm attached to the trigger to tip the hammer back. The nose we're so accustomed to today appears to have first been patented in 1856 by Gilles Marriott. This Smith & Wesson K-frame makes use of the full Marriott style of patent, although many years later after it was expired. We have a nose, we have an extension off the trigger, and we also have a very, very tiny little lip right in here. You may be confused by this guy, ignore him. It's this little tiny lip in here, just a little pucker. And so, let me just show you double action again, just to make sure. So I pull the trigger, it pushes up on the nose, it slips past the nose. Again, don't dry fire with the side plate off. Boom. It skips past the nose on the way back, and we're back in business, double action. For single action in a Marriott style system, you would cock the hammer, and what it's gonna do is it's gonna bring along the trigger because it's caught in between. So now this section's pushing on this section, and it's gonna bring it all the way up until it rolls off. And when it rolls off the top of that cliff, it's gonna catch at that little tiny ridge. And that little tiny ridge, boom, becomes our sear surface. So now this hammer is being held back by just a tiny surface contact right here, which means when we touch down on this trigger with any amount of force, a very light pull, it's going to release the hammer in order to fall. That gives us a very nice shot with almost no muscle work whatsoever. Now that Marriott nose plush lower extension is probably the most common way to get single or double action in a revolver, even today. But for viewers of our show, you already know it's not the only action out there. This Nagant 1878 uses the familiar nose system from the Marriott in order to do its double action. So there's our extension, push it over. However, there's no pursed lip here on the lower hammer extension. Instead, it still uses this old trip sear like we saw on the Chamelot-Delvigne. Let me just go ahead and cock that back. Click. And then when we pull the trigger, it's going to tip this and release the hammer like we're familiar with. Tip and release. So this is a hybridized system. It doesn't use just the Marriott. It uses a sear of its own design and the nose. And there's going to be a reason for this later because this actually, again, does two functions. Back to the Chamelot, it again has the sear, which is used for single action. And then tip and fire. Boom. But you may have noticed the double action doesn't use a hammer nose at all. Instead, we have, boy, that's like it's a crazy thing. We have a strut or a pawl. In this case, it's shaped a bit like a human hand that's trying to make a sock puppet. This actually comes from an old Tranter patent way back in the day. And what it does is it allows us to quite literally push the hammer back. So as I pull that trigger, you see it from the lower section. Let me make that clear. This lower tab is pushing back and around. So push, push, push. I don't want to let it dry fire until it slips off finally. Doom, and we fire. And the reason for the upper part of the hand is that when we do cock our hammer back for single action, the upper part of the hand allows this pawl to be dragged along. Whoop, until there, which means that it goes ahead and pre-positions our trigger where it needs to be. And also, we'll talk about this later in another section, we need some other bits of operation to work. So in this single and double action system, we have neither the nose nor do we have the underside of the hammer. This is a totally unique and different way of achieving the exact same result. This 1865 Danish design, which was actually later updated to centerfire, I don't want to confuse anybody on that front, but the lockwork is from 1865. This is a modification of a Adams Beaumont action. Now it is a double and single action, which you can see right here. We have this strut or arm that is very simple in construction. It's just hinged off the back of the trigger, biased towards the hammer by a spring, and it engages on a notch there. So if we pull for double action, it's just going to push her on back until it slips past, the hammer drops. Now, it's very critical when you have the single action fire to bring the trigger along with to set up the other elements of the mechanism. And the way this one does it is, let me show you, see? Might be hard to make out, but there's actually a hole through this strut that I can't quite get an angle on, and a hook on the hammer. If I let this down, you'll probably see that hook appear. Boom. See it down there at the bottom? Here, let me see if I can hold that for a second. There's a hook right here, and it's going through that strut because that strut is hollow. That's a very straightforward and easy way of doing the same thing. This system again uses a seer, by the way, for the single action component and the strut for the double. But wait, there is more, because this Swiss 1878 Warrant style of revolver has a very unique system. If I were to cock this hammer back, what you can't really see is down under there, we have the Marriott style of single action, which is that an extension off the back of the trigger is meeting a little purse lip extension off the hammer. So we've kept that single action, but look, there's no nose and there's no strut hidden up under there. You have to take my word because you can't see, but there's nothing in here, okay? What's happening during double action, actually, from here we can see those little lips, see them? What's happening in double action is we're actually picking up the underside of these lips with the bottom of the hand, a component that we're going to talk more about in a moment. So if I tip this back, this guy actually extends down in there and snags under the lips and therefore cocks that hammer back, which is a truly unique way of doing it. See how she rests on there? And then eventually, once you clear, she slips on by, and that's our double action. Okay, that's pretty unique. Now, of course, these are not all the ways to achieve single and double action fire. Just as an example, here's a really weird alternative, the Webley-Fosbery, which is a recoil-operated revolver. The force of a fired cartridge causes the upper assembly to travel rearward, automatically cocking the hammer for you for continuous single-action release. So that's a gun where you don't even have technically a double action, but you get that same rapid fire. So let me tell you, people are real creative. Now, while this has not been a complete list of actions, again, we're just trying to show you the variety available, and it's really fun to look at them. Alright, up next, rotation, the very heart of what it means to be a revolver. Our definition of a revolver does require a single barrel, and why only one barrel? Well, that's because they were expensive to make well. When fixed to the frame, they would be more precise shooting, and having just one barrel reduces the weight of the overall pistol. The trouble with one barrel and many chambers is that they must be, properly aligned, hole to hole. Any misalignment at best means the shot cannot be discharged accurately, and at worst it could mean catastrophic failure. For most modern revolvers, the worst you'll get is shaving around, which is an irritable nuisance, assuming you have proper eye protection and lead bullets. But jacketed rounds, higher pressure ammo, and a lack of lenses, let's just see how well we can keep things aligned. The earliest revolving arms required the user to manually spin the cylinder, which allowed them to align each of several shots with the bore. The best systems were actually spring-loaded to keep alignment during fire. Generally, when we think of revolvers, we don't picture manually indexing that cylinder like that. We imagine a mechanism that does the work for us. Using our Reichs revolver, we can actually see a very simple rotation setup, which is that we have a hand, which is actually a very common way of rotating the cylinder. It's engaged on some teeth in there. I'll show you those in a moment. The hand is attached to this hammer, and it is sprung forward. So if I were to grab hold of this and sort of pry it back for a second and then let go, see, it goes forward. Let me see if I can do that a little more clearly. Back, and it wants to go forward. So it wants to go to the front of the gun. We're going to drive it up. That means it's going to drag its nose right along the back side of that cylinder. When it does so, it's going to rotate it. The cylinder is rotated. And then when we drop the hammer, the hand is going to want to come back down, and we don't want it to counter-rotate the cylinder, which is why it's spring-loaded, because that's going to allow it to flex back off and snap back in. Let me show you that as best I can with this heavy hammer. Click, and she's reset back over the next tooth. Now, this guy is essentially acting as a pawl against a ratchet, and I'll show you that ratchet in just a second. But in some sources, this is even called a pawl. The reason I tend to say hand very specifically is because there are other revolvers that have other things that are acting as a pawl, and so I would like to identify this pawl as the hand. You can call it whatever you like, as long as you understand how it works. With the cylinder out, and I can show you these ratchet teeth. Okay, so it's an inclined plane, and then a vertical cliff, and then an inclined plane and vertical cliff, plane, cliff, plane, cliff. What that does, it means that our hand will push in this direction and rotate, and then when it comes back, it'll tick off. So push versus tick off. So if you'd like to see that in person, I'll try to get this into the focal plane. There is our hand, and as we come back, it would rotate. And then as we come forward, it would click down, and then as it went back, it would rotate it around. I'm sorry, guys, freehand in this. And as we come back, it would click down. So that's the literally ratcheting way that these things tend to work. Although, again, not the only way that this could possibly be done, just the most common. By the way, many people are familiar with the fact that lots of revolvers make a audible click. And as you can probably tell, that's usually the hand snapping past one of the ratchet teeth. Now you can spring the hand forward a number of ways, but let's look at the two most common while we're on the topic. Now, most revolvers I've seen have the hand attached to the trigger, and a lot of the early ones have a flat spring attached directly to the hand in order to drive it forward. In this case, the Chamelot-Delvigne has that set up, although it's not really flexed against anything at the moment because we've taken the cover off of this gun. But you get the idea. This spring would be pressed upon and then press this guy forward. What you may see in more recent guns, like this Prideaux from Italy, is what has actually been a bit of a bother to me. I have been touting this as a modified Galland action, and then I found out that it was used by a man named Fudd before that. And now I've actually been able to go even further back to one Hubert Joseph Comblain. Yep, same guy as the single-shot rifle that we covered in one of our episodes. I'm very excited to say that his patent for this particular arm goes all the way back to 1859 and appears to be the earliest one, and definitely about specifically this overreaching arm. So, excuse me, but I'm a little excited to finally get to, the root of that. Basically, what happens here is this one spring applies pressure to the hammer, which is something that we were concerned about before, but also applies the other half of its pressure on through the hand and down into the trigger. So this spring is also pushing the trigger forward, and it's biasing the hand to want to rotate over center because of the cut that is in here and the shape of this arm over center to the front of the action, which makes it a very efficient system. Hammer and trigger and rotation all on one spring. It's very impressive. Let's talk about cylinder direction. In the case of this Reichs revolver, yeah, we're going clockwise. Can't go counterclockwise, can go clockwise. Stop, go. Now, in the case of this Colt New Army, well, it actually can't go anywhere at the moment. We'll talk about that in a moment, but the way it indexes is counterclockwise, and it's actually in fairly poor time. There's a good reason for that, though, because when you make your decision about which way to rotate the revolver, you make a little bit of decision about which side of the gun you're going to put the lockwork on, but also in certain circumstances, your rotation direction may impact other mechanisms, like in the case of this gun, which uses a swing-out cylinder. I'll talk about those deeper in a moment, but the swing-out cylinder has an arm, which then comes over center from the right to the left. In this case is in terrible shape, but you get the idea. Since we're rotating from counterclockwise, our hand is on the opposite side of this gun over here, and it wants to push up and over the top towards you, the viewer. When it does that, it's pushing against this particular crane arm, and it's flexing it ever so slightly every time we index or fire the gun, because the hand is also holding the cylinder as we fire in many cases. And over time, that flex, which I can now feel is a pretty solid wiggle, is going to mean that the synchronization between the cylinder and the barrel is slightly lost. That will affect accuracy, and if it gets bad enough, we'll start shaving rounds and having bigger mechanical problems. Now, it's not enough to just rotate our cylinder. We also have to stop that rotation at the appropriate time. For most revolvers, this is handled by a small stud known as, and you'll never guess this term, the cylinder stop. I know I use this Reichs revolver a lot, but boy is it easy to see, and boy is it a very simple mechanism. So, in this particular case, the cylinder stop is here. It's this blade that interacts with these notches. There's 6 of them because there's 6 shots in this gun. We have a teeter-totter assembly with a pivot point here. It is biased by this spring, but it's also interacting with our trigger. Now, how does this work exactly? Well, when we cock our action, watch what happens. See it riding along for a second until tick. Now it's in there. And when we fire the gun, it's going to stay there holding the cylinder by riding in essentially one of these guys, but down there. It's going to hold it so that it can't rotate in either direction until boom. And then as I release this trigger, watch right here where the trigger is going to bap the other side of the teeter-totter. Actually, I have to manually rebound this for that to happen. Watch the trigger come back around. There it goes. Tip. And now it's loose again. Since it's dropped, the cylinder is free to rotate. And so if we were to cock again, it will rotate the cylinder. As the trigger is cammed out of the way by the shape on the hammer, it frees the teeter-totter. The teeter-totter can now bounce back up at the front. And see this wear line here? This is actually from, you can see how it sort of, there's a gap here where it disappears for a second and then it reappears. That's because that is when this guy touches down on the outer wall of the cylinder and starts dragging against it because it's being biased into it. And so it's just pushing, pushing, pushing. And then once it hits one of these, it clicks in. Click. And now our cylinder is locked and aligned for firing. The Nagant 1878 has the cylinder stop embedded in the shape of the trigger. That's this nubbin right here. And it interacts with these scallops. Having the stop built into the trigger actually goes way back to an early Adams double action patent, so it's nothing new. This is one directional. See how the scallops kind of only have a lockup on one side. And the reason for that is because our hand is going to keep pressure throughout on this mechanism as we fire. So if you think about it, the trigger will always be back at the moment of fire, which means the hand will always be up. So the hand can keep this cylinder from rotating counterclockwise. It will always be biasing it clockwise. What we have to do is prevent it from going too far clockwise. And so that's what the one wall of the scallop is. So if I were to cock this back manually, you'll notice that the little bip ends up in the scallop, and therefore it cannot rotate any more clockwise. It can't come back counterclockwise because the hand is pressing up against the ratchet. And in that way, this cylinder is aligned for actually being able to fire. It's pretty cool. This massive Austrian gasser also relies on its hand down inside here to prevent counter rotation. But instead of having scallops or divots like the other two guns, we actually have raised projections, little lugs that are sloped on one side and then steep cliff here. So it's almost like a really extended ratchet. So 2 ratchets in this gun, right? This hard surface comes along and contacts yet again another one of those trigger-bound cylinder stops. It's just that in this particular case, the gun is, let me get this all the way back, and then boom, the gun is now locked between one of those bumps and the hand, and they are sticking out of the cylinder instead of being recessed down in. Just another way to do that. Now, most cylinder stops tend to fall roughly into the behavior that I've shown you so far. However, as you're going to learn in this show, there's always exceptions. This Colt 1878 is a little hard to see inside of, but this is our hand, and we're going to see a very unique cylinder stop system based entirely on the hand. Now, what I want you to notice for the moment is that I'm going to work this action by cocking the hammer, and I want you to listen for a very unique click. And watch the hand. You see that little pip at the end, and that as it snugged in there? Now, the last click is the sear, but that little lug sound right before, let's get that one more time, right? So right before the click. Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't rotate the cylinder at all. That would help. There we go. There. Did you see that cylinder snap in like that? Well, that's because the hand is really containing the cylinder in both directions. Let's get this apart so that you can see it a little easier. With our cylinder out, we can actually see the hand down in there, and I'll pull it on up. I don't know if you can quite make it out, but we have a divot here, an actual, right there, a hard line and then a peel away, and then the hand itself. So this surface is what's initially pushing the cylinder over, but eventually this surface gets over the lug on the cylinder, the ratchet tooth on the cylinder, and then this little claw drops back in, and it grabs hold of that particular cylinder stud. If you'd like to see what that looks like on the cylinder itself, they're right here. And you can tell these are very pronounced shapes that fit just inside of that hand. This is a system begging to be walked out of time by any number of geometries, but it's pretty cool that the hand is holding the entire thing on rotation. Now there's also another function of cylinder stop that is in the gate in this particular gun. So if I get this, let me see if I can show you that. I'm sorry folks, there may be a little bit of an issue on focus, but right here there's a little nubbin. You may even see that it's sort of a separate part that can be tuned. And what that nubbin does is it also interacts on the outside surface of one of these guys to prevent counter rotation during the crucial period when the hand is being let back down. Because if this is full of ammo and you fire a couple rounds, then it becomes unweighted on one side. And you could have a situation where you've lined up, this guy fires, there's loaded, loaded, unloaded, unloaded. So this side wants to droop, right? Well, actually, I guess it would be the other way. The rotation on this is the other way. But one side wants to droop. You don't want it to droop because then you'll recycle an empty chamber. So you have to have a way to temporarily resist that rotation for just a moment, and that is provided by this notch here. Looking at the gate, we can see that it is acting as a ratchet tooth. Watch. Goes out, clicks down, and prevents counter rotation. Now, actually, let me make something very clear. The gate is not acting as a cylinder stop for firing. Let me open that gate for a second. Fire the gun. Boom. I'm still holding the trigger down. And look, no rotation. The hand is doing all the work at the moment. However, there is a secret to this gun, like I said, which is that as I release the trigger, you could get rollback. See how far back I was able to roll that? Because the trigger's been released, and we need to be able, it's the double hook of the hand. You know, I have an air gap because of that design, and you have to find a way to deal with that, which is dealt with on the stud in this gate. So, if the gate closed, it's locked in now. The hand is also locking it, but as I release the trigger, the hand stops unlocking it. But the gate keeps me from reversing it. You can see if I really torque on it, I can force it, but that's really unlikely to happen. And then we go forward, and it cams right on by. Another ratchet tooth inside of a revolver. Now, introducing that idea of resistance to rotation brings us into another point to consider for the rotation category, which is the null state of the revolver and how it prevents rotation. That's going to sound weird, but here's what I'm talking about. When we go to fire this gun, and I lock her back, and I pull the trigger, and it goes bang, that cylinder does not want to rotate left or right. But in order for the gun to work, it must be released and then allowed to index again at some point. So the cylinder has to be able to rotate, and yet there are times when we don't want it to. Most early designs did not allow the cylinder to counter-rotate, to rotate backwards. And the big reason that it wanted to prevent that is because you didn't want it going back far enough that a previously shot round could sort of hug back down and then get re-indexed, and then you try to shoot that round again and nothing happens, right? But most did not prevent it from over-rotating. And at that point, it's kind of an unusual scenario because the resistance of the cylinder itself should prevent it, but if you have a particularly smooth gun and you're handling it in odd ways or even dropping it in a firefight, you could in theory bump your cylinder. And you can hear, I can roll in one direction for certain. Now, if I have a 6-shot gun and I engage a bad guy, boom, boom, and then I drop the gun or brush up against a wall or who knows what, but it rolls once, twice, who knows. Then 4 more bad dudes jump out. This is a weirdly ideal scenario for someone who has to be a perfect shot, but you would have 4 rounds for 4 bad dudes. But your timing may be off because you're going to go bad dude 1, bad dude 2, bad dude 3, and click. And you don't necessarily know if that click's bad ammo, or that you somehow rolled your cylinder. That might not even be one of the first 3 assumptions you make. And then you just got to spam that trigger until you get back around to finding that live round, wherever it went missing in the interaction. That's not ideal. It's also not super likely to happen, but it's not ideal if it does. So, is there anything we can do to prevent that out-of-lock rotation completely? The British would deal with this problem on their Enfield revolvers, the Mark I and the Mark II. Let's get a closer look. Originally, these revolvers suffered the same problem as the 1878s, right? Fire the gun, and as I release the trigger, I can roll backwards. So they solved that problem the same way with the gate. You can see some cuts here on the cylinder wall, and they correspond with a notch that I don't really need to show you on the gate, right? So we close the gate, we fire, and boom, we can't back roll. But we can forward roll. So what do? Well, we go for more notches. If you take a close look, you'll see the original notch right here, and then the secondary very tight notch, right? Well, that is just a little divot. That means it's difficult to index the gun forward. Not impossible. You can see if I push, I can flex against the plate and get it to happen, but it's not happening unintentionally. We also still have that counter rotation prevention. In this way, we've acted sort of like a detent. It keeps it from wanting to over-rotate. On the K-frame, the cylinder stop is this stud here. You can see where it interacts. Now, let me get this closed back up, and because I have it partially disassembled, it's not gonna like me very much. There we go. That guy then comes down a little arm and is actually on this rocker, which has a sliding pin set that then interacts with the trigger. And what this weirdly complicated shape does is it goes ahead and engages that lock whenever we're not actively using the trigger, unless it's all the way back. So take a look. Watch her tip on down as I pull. So that's going to free the cylinder to actually rotate, right? Then it snaps back in place at the last second so that the hammer falls with a locked cylinder. As we release it, it actually indexes forward, keeping the cylinder locked. See? Cylinder's still locked, still locked, still locked. Never unlocks, all right? Until we start to pull the trigger again, at which point it unlocks just in time to start rotating, and then snaps back in time for it to lock for firing. So in other words, you have no out-of-lock rotations of this cylinder. Not until, you're ready to actually have it indexed to fire. No losing your place. Again, there will be a myriad of ways to achieve stopping the cylinder both in lock and, for certain revolvers, at rest. The most striking alternative, again, is the Webley-Fosbery, which has the movement of the cylinder inscribed into its surface. This was done because a typical hand could not handle all of this mass going back and forth. Man, the Fosbery is weird. There are also just a handful of fancy indexers in this category of mechanisms. Let's say gas seals. We actually already saw one with that manual indexer. But here's another way of doing it, easily the most common gas seal revolver, the Nagant 1895, in which, inside of here, our hand not only rotates our cylinder, but also pushes it forward. See how it's spring biased to the rear? When it is pushed forward, our cylinder actually wraps its chamber mouth, one of those guys, over that forcing cone. And because of the nature of its unique 7.62 cartridge with a very long case that goes past the bullet, it seals up, keeping the gas from escaping in between the barrel and the cylinder. Now, despite the fact that this is the most common gas seal revolver, it is still fairly complicated inside, and getting that action to work means adding a lot of extra spring pressure to your pull, so this proved to be a very unpopular choice. All right, we have the hammer setting off rounds, we have the trigger setting off the hammer. Either or both can help drive rotation or time stopping rotation, or neither, I guess, in some strange cases. See why I need a broad set of categories instead of just a parts list? Well, at this point, we theoretically have a revolver, and some early designs don't have anything to do with the next step, but this is a show about understanding generally modern revolvers, so let's talk about safeties. Now, when it comes to revolvers, safety is almost always focused on hammer control. I say almost because there are some other mechanisms that we're going to see, but they're actually going to be integrated into a later category. So, for now, let's just talk about hammer control, the ability to prevent the hammer from going where we don't want it to go. All the way back to our Patterson, we find an interest in hammer control. In this case, it's the half-cock position, halfway back to fully cocked. With the hammer in this position, it's mechanically kept away from striking the percussion caps, which allows us to rotate the cylinder, and that helps with loading, setting our caps if we need to, although in this gun, we'll talk more about it, but this is really a disassembly procedure. What other things it does for us is it keeps any sort of rearward blow from driving this unexpectedly into a percussion cap, unless you hit it hard enough to crack the tooth that's holding it back. But, you know, that still takes a fair amount of force. And then the other benefit that we're getting from this is that it's locking out the trigger. It's kind of like a safety, right? Finally, I will say that if we go to a full cock and don't quite make it, and, oh, slip, well, good. We didn't accidentally discharge the gun. You do, however, have to make it to at least the half cock, so I can get pretty far back and still maybe run into a problem. Now, one of the big potential failings for the half-cock system is that if you were to drop this gun and have it land in just such a way as to get some inertia into these, frankly, fairly heavy components, then a little bip on the trigger and a little bip on the hammer from inertia, and we'll slip right through, and we may end up with another accidental discharge in this case. But overall, fairly good. This Colt Dragoon, however, has a series of pins on the back of the cylinder. See that little guy right there? It's kind of hard to make out, but he's pretty critical. That's because he aligns with a corresponding dip at the base of the hammer. And the reason for that is so that we can actually, if we're very careful, we can let this guy down and then index the cylinder over and put him on that little divot. And now rotation is prevented. The hammer is down in between two percussion caps where it will not set off the gun. However, this again is vulnerable to inertia. A little more inertia than the last time with just the half cock, but still not what you call a hard block. Your friendly neighborhood Reichs revolver controls the hammer with a manual safety. Boom. Nada. It's actually a little difficult to see that because these are two separate pieces, so let's use one of our old animations again. It has a half-cut rod that turns into the path of the hammer, preventing it from bouncing if dropped, finally solving the problem of the early percussion pistols, after, frankly, better solutions had become available. Inside this Nagant 1878, we can see another very common European version of the half-cock, that sear that we were talking about earlier, the one that was used for the full cock position of the hammer, and then is tripped by the trigger in order to release it. But if we catch it early, right there on that notch, then we are effectively in a half-cock-ish position. I'll explain the difference in a moment, but let's look at what we got. We can't really blow the hammer from the rear unless we hit it really hard in order to skip past that tooth, and we have rebounded it away from any centerfire primers that are in there. We've retracted the firing pin so it can't interfere with the rotation of the cylinder. This is pretty handy stuff. We also get, and I want to do this a little lightly, but we get that accidental early slip-off prevention. Yep, no accidental fire there if we're, getting through, if we're trying to cock this manually with our thumb and we slip, we're not going to get a bang by accident. So it's a pretty good little safety system. Where it differs from a traditional half cock is that because of the double action nature of this revolver, I can pull the trigger, or in this case, shove it with my thumbs, and look, she's still running. It doesn't actually lock out the trigger. Another disadvantage of this system is that if we fire the gun, boom, well, it hasn't manually rebounded. And in this gun in particular, we can still rotate that cylinder, so we could load up and potentially drag our firing pin on a primer. More on that in a moment, but we have to know to manually rebound our hammer. We have to pull it back just a bit on purpose. That's a potential limitation. This, single action only, so nothing happening, and there we go, locked and ready to go. This single action only 1883 Nagant has a pretty cool improvement to it over the manual rebound. This one has an automatic rebound, so if I were to go ahead and fire this thing, kabloom, and then release the trigger, watch this arm. Ooh, 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 and click into a little divot. That means it's nice and securely set in there. I can bang on the back of the hammer and not have it fall into a round. I can rotate my cylinder and not have my firing pin get in the way. This is pretty nice, and it's automatic. It's pretty cool, but it's also massive, and it's taking up the entire face of the hammer, which means we don't have any room for a traditional nose or a lot of other double action components that we would normally consider putting in one of these guns. So what Nagant did is he relieved, boy, this is going to be hard to see, he relieved some of the right side of the hammer way down in there, on the other side opposite of where we're looking. And he kept the finger as a very flat extension. Let me go ahead and see if you can see that in there. See the finger poking out? And then we fire the gun and watch down in there our little finger as it rebounds the hammer. This actually would be the same system that was kept over for the other Nagants, like the 1895 Russian, the smaller ones. Unfortunately, because it is just sort of a blade in there and it's off-center, they can get damaged. I've seen at least one 1895 in which it had snapped off and nobody had noticed up until that point. So go ahead and make sure you know how your gun's supposed to work, boys, because that one did not have its rebound. A more common rebound to see in our show is the Warnant style of rebound, again seen in this Swiss 1878. It uses a variation of the Comblain's arm, although this time not attached to the spring, and it turns it into an automatic rebounder of the hammer, which is a little hard to see with everything assembled. Give me just a moment here. Here are our two critical parts for this operation. The hammer with an extension at its bottom, and this overarching arm, which has a turn very specifically placed here, and you can see it's even got a bit of a bevel to it on this side. And what's happening is, as the hammer is forward, this arm is sprung overhand this way, right? And so what it wants to do is it wants to push down into this, at which point it will tip the hammer back as it pushes down. Actually a little lower on the arm usually, but you get the idea. That is being caused again by this interaction right here, which is probably a little out of focus, but it's that shelf. Whenever you're looking at it dead on sideways, it's hard to picture that that guy is behind there, but it's this surface and this surface that we really care about. With the gun reassembled, we can see how this works. Again, our shelf is right there, sitting right at the edge of the tail of the hammer. And so, if I were to fire this guy, boom. As long as the trigger is back, the hand is up, therefore this arm is being held up. When I let the trigger down, the spring pressure from this lower part of the V-spring is going to push down on the arm, push down on the trigger. The whole thing is going to lower, and as it lowers, that shelf in there is going to ride down on this extension at the bottom of the hammer, throwing it this way, and then therefore the top of the hammer is going to come back and automatically rebound. Ooh, one more time if you're curious. There we go. Now, this is an automatic rebound. It is a beautifully simple one that makes use of a part that would already be in your revolver if you were doing a Comblain derivative revolver, which is a very efficient style of revolver. However, there is a limitation here in that it is somewhat easy to overcome. Because it is ultimately spring pressure, a good enough blow will distort the hammer. Now, I will say it is shaped in such a way as to resist this, so I can get it to sort of drop just a bit. See that little tick? And then it really locks in on itself. And at that point, we've got almost like a Luger center lock, where these two pieces are linearly compressed into each other. Well, this one's rotationally, and then this one's linearly compressed. And it really does not want to be overcome. However, unlike a true hard block, this could still get enough inertia behind the hammer to be overcome and presents a potential risk. You see, usually after a series of freak accidents, often involving long falls and hard flooring, revolver makers became interested in having an automatic hammer safety, a block that would prevent the hammer from ever reaching the primer of a live cartridge unless you were actively pulling the trigger, intentionally trying to set the gun off. This 1870 gasser has an external hammer block in the form of a flat spring with two projections on it. This actually goes back to an August Francot patent from 1865. The forward pin is sloped. Let me see if you can see that. It's sloped on this surface here. The rear pin actually has a bit of a notch cut in it to make it nice and flat up against what would be the tail of the hammer. I'm sorry, but this is a fixed frame gun, so it's very hard to show you that interaction. But the idea behind it is by pulling the trigger, it will come up and flex on this pin here, this lower pin. Let me rotate this around. The trigger will push out on this pin, which therefore retracts this pin from the back. When the pin is out, it is no longer in the way of the hammer. When the pin is in, it blocks the hammer. You can actually see that if I quickly reassemble this guy. Now, since the hammer is down, it's currently in the unlocked position. It has to be, it's resting against the hammer. But if I pop the hammer back, watch what happens. Snaps in. Now the hammer is blocked. In order to unblock the hammer, I have to pull the trigger, which will cam that out of the way. And right when we're finally back where we belong, you hear that snick, then it will allow the hammer to fall. I've actually been riding my thumb on it again. Don't want to cause undue damage, but you get the idea. The hammer is blocked in this position, so safe from being banged around by a fairly strong cross pin. And then pull, cams out of the way, and we can drop her on in. This Italian Bodeo has another one of these external flexing hammer blocks, this time being the Dimancea. So if I were to open this up and flip it over, you'd see there's a sort of sloped pin there, which actually is actuated by that overarching comblane style arm. Whenever we pull the trigger, the arm comes up, it flexes on the pin, and then this guy, let me see if I can get that where you can see it. This guy, focus, gets flexed outward. Let me put that on the gun so you can see. So, as I pull the trigger, we bring on the hammer back, and then look at that flexing starting. And then, boom, right there. Flexed out of the way. It allows the hammer to fall, and you can see it's to the left of the hammer. If I release it, it tucks itself back in the way of the hammer so the hammer can't fall onto whatever primer may be in there. It's a fairly good external safety system. Flex out of the way, and boom. The one critical problem with this is that when it's fully flexed, you may get some grit, mud, muck, pebbles, whatever in there, and then it will stay flexed and no longer be a hammer block for you. That's not ideal. Notice, by the way, that this is working in conjunction with a Warrant style rebound, which is popping this guy back so that this block can get in there to do its business. So we are both rebounded and blocked. A very good and safe system. This later Bodeo doesn't use the Dimancea style safety at all. Instead, it has a linear operating safety that's set down inside the frame. No external, no flexing. Instead, how it works is that we still have that cross piece down in there. It's a little hard to see. But you notice there's a scallop out of the left side of the hammer. When this is high enough, it fits into the scallop and allows the hammer to fall. When it's low, there is no scallop in the hammer to correspond to it, and therefore it is actively blocking the hammer. I can't blow that in there. Again, it has an automatic rebound as well. So if we were to, I have to free my trigger in order to use it. If we pull the trigger, it starts to rise, and we'll notice that at its peak, it has just enough room to let that hammer actually drive home. The automatic rebound kicks in, this guy slides on down, and he blocks that hammer from being beaten into the firing pin. This is a very simple and more elegant solution that is less prone to fouling or jamming. Smith & Wesson actually opted for both a automatic rebound and a hammer block. So we have this sliding rebound here, which has a coil spring inside that wants to project it forward. If we go ahead and fire this gun, boom, then you'll see that it's set up behind the toe of the hammer. And when we release, it's going to push forward on the toe, cocking back on the hammer. And then it's actually going to slip up under. And we're going to end up with a flat plane on a flat plane, which means it's already acting as an initial hammer block. Like, that's hard to overcome even on its own. But just to make sure it was extra secure, they added a flat spring with a little bit of an L tab to it here inside the cover. Now, the idea behind this is this tab blocks the hammer from firing the gun. And in order to get past it, it needs to be flexed inward because it wants to flex outward. So or rather, it needs to be flexed outward. It wants to flex inward. We're just backwards. So this wants to be popped out. We're going to flex it in by pressing on this tab. The actual pressing of that tab is done by this ramp on our hand as it rises. So when we start pulling the trigger, the hand rises, it flexes in the tab clears the hammer. This system was found to be inadequate around World War II. The story that I am told is that one was dropped from the flight deck of an aircraft carrier, landed on its hammer, and still managed to discharge. So they came up with something else that really didn't interfere with the construction of the pistol. In this case, we still have all the same elements. This is the gun I removed the hand from earlier, so don't get confused. We don't even need the hand for how this works, though, because the new hammer block goes all the way across the front of the hammer. Look at how big that guy is. And he goes down in there, blocking the hammer, and then it rides on a pin that was added to the rebound. So now, if we are not pulling the trigger, this block is in the way of the hammer deliberately. And whenever we do pull the trigger, and oh, there we go, our rebound block comes back. Therefore, this gets pulled down out of the path and it fires. And then once she rebounds, this guy gets shoved back up. Well, if you had your side plate on, this guy would get shoved back up. By the way, this is why it's very fun to manipulate revolver actions with the side plates off, but you should not trust that you're not going to lose anything. Anyway, this guy gets then pushed back up and blocks the hammer again. A beautifully simple solution, if not one prone to loss when you take the gun apart. You'll never guess what I'm about to say. There are other non-hammer forms of revolver safety. There are other ways to control the hammer. This is just one set of considerations, and I urge you to explore every possible design out there and discover what else has been invented. Now, one thing I do know about and can show you as we go is that our current category does overlap with our next category, the reloading topic. I've found that whatever mechanism is used to load or unload a particular revolver is often the defining feature of that gun, for the average person anyway. The other features largely go unseen. They're hidden and usually automatic, but loading, that's a mechanical trick that you, the user, must navigate in order to operate the firearm. And there are a myriad of variations here. The Colt Patterson, as the first industrial age revolver, still used a muzzle loading setup. Well, muzzle end of the cylinder. This required the user to disassemble the gun in order to load it. Both the later Patterson and the next Colt model, the Walker, sported loading levers on the guns and had a cutaway under the barrel so that you can get a projectile right on in there. This way we can load our powder and press our bullet home right here on the gun. The priming cap, of course, goes here at the rear, and we can even see where a relief had to be made to allow that operation on the fly. Muzzle loading would soon give way to metallic cartridge, and there's a whole story about the Roland White patent in the United States that we're not really covering. We're an international show. Metallic cartridge could be loaded by simply inserting them into the rear of the action. Among the simplest ways of achieving this, however, was the loading gate. Now, our Reichs revolver uses metallic cartridges, which are loaded, thankfully, from the rear. You notice that I have to open the loading gate in order to do this, and the loading gate would be standard on most military revolvers, at least up into World War I. We'll see the exceptions in a moment. But on this particular gun, we already have some help in that the loading gate is biased into one of two positions. So if I get over center here, if you see how it jerks, and then snaps closed, so the spring's holding it shut. That way it doesn't flop around while we're firing the gun. Then when we open it, they also gave us the advantage of a little bit of bias so that it snicks all the way open so that while we're loading the gun, again, it's not flopping around getting in our way. It's pretty handy. If we take a look back here, we'll see that this is probably a good time for me to actually spell out something we were talking about in the hammer safety period. Notice there's some grooves cut between the backs of the cylinders. They're recessed, so the rim of the cartridge can set down in there nice and deep into the cylinder. But then where that firing pin would make contact, you want to make sure you left some room for it to drag in case it starts rotating with a little overextension. In the case of this gun, if we had the hammer all the way down, Now, it does lock the cylinder because of the mechanism, but also, even without that cylinder lock, the reason it's there is to prevent what would happen if we were to load cartridges in here and start rotating the cylinder with the firing pin already resting down. We may scrape it right across a live primer and possibly get an unwanted detonation. So that manual rebound is necessary before we load. So that's where one of our safety features have interacted with our loading procedure. Now, this guy has no bias, no mechanism for rotating or helping you to secure the rotation in the correct position. So you have to get really good at lining up this little hole with this scallop so that you can get your round down in there. If you get too far over, it doesn't line back up. And if you get far enough, you get past that hand, and then if I didn't manage to load this guy, I gotta go all the way back around if I want to try him again. So this is a little bit of a potential bother. It's not doing a lot for us in terms of helping to do the loading. When it comes to unloading, the Revolver was not equipped with an ejector rod. A lot of people say, oh, we'll just take it apart. You know, on the other side of this gun, it's a lever and a pin, and you can take the cylinder out. Talk about that at towards the end of this episode, but generally, you want to keep your gun assembled, especially in a battlefield. You don't want to drop or lose anything. So, what do they do for an ejector rod? Well, they issued these. This is a brass piece with a loop in it. The loop is there so that you can run a piece of leather that would have been attached to your holster through it. That way this stays with your holster. So whenever you fired your 6 shots on your Revolver, just open her on up, go to your holster, unstrap this guy, feed him out through the piece of leather, take this unit and line up each of your 6 cylinders manually and poke out your 1 spent case and line it up again. And I really hope you're not going to need 2 volleys of fire from this gun during a firefight, because this is very involved. Anyway, once all 6 are out, load your gun, close her up, and then attach this back onto your holster so you don't lose it. Or I guess, you know, if you're in a hurry, throw it in your pocket, right? If this seems depressing, let me assure you the later 1883 model was issued with a wooden stick because it was just as effective and a lot cheaper. This is obviously a very slow process and requires an extra bit of kit that is frankly a little easy to lose. And while the Revolver was way behind the times in its day, the separate ejector rod wasn't a weird call in the early days of metallic cartridge. Some commercial pinfire designs actually had ejector rods that fit into the butt of their grips. This Austrian gasser has a fixed ejector rod attached permanently to the gun. Now it's held in place at the moment by this thumb screw, which you actually have to rotate to loosen in order to get this guy to work back and forth. Now I have to manually index my cylinder, then drive this guy back. We would have ejected a case. You get the idea. 6, reload. In this case, by the way, that just flops around in the way. Boy, I mean, it's good that it hinges down like that so that it kind of biases for loading, but the German system seems to be a lot easier on the user, right? Now, the interesting thing about this wingnet setup is that it suggests that this gun may have had another purpose for its ejector rod, because as laughably simple as this might be, and almost delicate in some ways, I mean, this may have been used as a manual safety. I know of at least one other design that considers the ejector rod to be a form of manual safety, and the way that works is if you were to align it with a cylinder, or a chamber in the cylinder rather, and then tighten it so that it's just sticking in there a little bit, or a lot of it, then the cylinder cannot rotate because it's being held by this, and since it cannot be rotated, that sort of hand pressure gets put back through the system and keeps the hammer from coming back. It keeps you from being able to fire the gun or to cock it all the way back for single action fire. So it may just be that this little guy was included as a way to let you lock out your revolver until you very clearly intended to fire it. The early Colt patterns tend to use ejector rods that are fixed to the outside of the gun as well. They're shrouded, unlike the gasser, and in this case we can see that this one is actually sprung. So that means we would push this to eject and then just release. And then we would push this to eject one and then just release. It saves us that one motion of pulling it back forward, and also saves having to secure this in some way. The spring just keeps it constantly pressed forward and out of the way of the action unless you pull it back in order to eject for just a moment. No lockouts or screws or anything like that. Our Swiss Warrant actually has a fairly complicated fixed ejector rod. The way this one works is that we first have to flip out the tab for it, and then you'll notice I still can't move it yet, and that's because this is not completely cylindrical. See that square cut to it? It has a sort of bias. I don't know if it comes through on the camera, but I can feel that it wants to be here. It very much wants to be there. You can feel it bias over. Hold on. Yep, it wants to be there. Once it's clear, it sort of wants to be here, and then when you get it into place, it finally sort of gently snicks into its position there. That's because only in this position can it move rearward, which means they're really trying to avoid having an accidental jamming of the system. They don't want this to ever flick over, fall in, and cause a jam with you not noticing it as the shooter. Once you're in this configuration, this guy right here is a spring, and it's the one that's been putting pressure on the system the whole time, but it also, in this particular setting, touches down on the rod in such a way that it wants to hold it in this forward position. I have to overcome the pressure of this spring in order to start driving it rearward. Once I do that, I feel it sort of pop, and then I'm back and I'm sliding smooth. So I eject, and then it snaps back into the forward position. You can very clearly feel when you're in the right spot. So that way, no accidents. And it's all being done by some geometry and a single spring. It's actually a really clever design. We're also going to see that flipping this piece over allows us access to something else, but that's for another topic in a moment. Our 1895 Nagant makes use of a fairly old system, which is to have the ejector rod hidden in the central arbor. So I can just rotate this guy to sort of detach him. And then, boom. Now the reason I had to rotate him is this keyway here. So you push it in and turn it slightly, and that keeps it from falling out the front. There's a flat spring here applying pressure so that it resists turning and falling out while you're firing the gun. So you turn, pull her out, and then flip the whole collar over, a collar wrapped around the barrel, so that you can then, let me get my gate open. You can then push it manually back and pull it forward. You'll notice this is probably the weakest of all the ejector rods we've seen. It's almost delicate, but that doesn't matter much because you're only really using it for ejecting, and when you're not using it, it's so shrouded away that it can be a very small and light system that is otherwise shielded and protected inside of the gun. Looking closer at the Nagant, we can see that, yep, we have those little notches, those little ratchet teeth that are used against the gate to prevent counter rotation. And sure enough, it locks up in there and eventually taps down on that wing that's on the gate. But there's something else going on in here, because if we look, and you should always look for clues in your revolvers, there's a little detent right here, a little scallop. See that guy? It's clearly hard on one side and tapers on the other. And let's go ahead and hear this, because a lot of people have noticed that there's an odd sound when you rotate a Nagant 1895. Conk. Tick. That's your hand. But conk. What is conk? Tick. There's the hand. And conk. Well, the conk, you may not have noticed, is coming from in here. This projection, actually I can flip her over. This projection on the gate is tapered and fits up against the cylinder. This uses the Nagant's unique gas seal system. Remember, this guy is sprung to want to come back towards you, and yet it's designed to be able to be driven forward. Well, every time we rotate the cylinder, there we go, we drive it forward, and then it's allowed to snick back in. Forward, and then back. Just a little tiny movement. But what that's doing is it's serving like a detent, and it's telling you, the loader, where the alignment point is for loading a cartridge. 7 rounds in this particular cylinder, so they're not all 6 rounds, but I roll, and I know when to stop when I feel dunk. And when I feel it, I can even counter-rotate a little bit, because that flat side of the scallop is resisting counter-rotation. So this is helping me bias the revolver into each loading position. Roll, counter roll, roll, click, counter roll, roll, click, counter roll. And that allows me to very quickly feel out each of the 7 positions as I work my ejector or as I load my rounds. An even stranger detent system can be found on this Swiss 1878, which you may have noticed doesn't have a loading gate whatsoever. It's not missing, it's not broken, there never was one. So how do we keep the cartridges from falling out? Well, if you watch me work the gun for a second, you'll see it snaps very quickly past any position in which you might allow a cartridge to fall out. And every time we actually fire the gun, well, this cross piece is what's in the way, and neither of the rimmed cartridges that would be in these two chambers would be able to fall out of the gun whatsoever. So your exposure time is right in this little window. Oop, God, it's hard to hit because the gun is timed such as to avoid it. There we go. Right in that window is where you could potentially lose a cartridge, but you'd pretty much have to be firing straight up at a bird or something. So it's probably not considered a major concern and saved on a lot of parts and consideration if you think about it. Also lets you see your own shells. So how do you load the gun then, right? Well, you manually index it to align it, but of course it wants to bias away from this. As a matter of fact, when it's at rest, you see it resists being counter-rotated or rotated. And how it's resisting that is actually this band here, this ridge line. This broad band, then a valley. But what you don't understand or can't see right away sometimes is that this center section right here is lower than this ridge or this ridge. So it's almost valley, ridge, soft lead into like a low plateau. And then we're back up on a ridge and we're down in a valley. These interact with the front of the trigger, which is just an extension that works like a D10. It's going against the trigger spring pressure, which in this case goes all the way back to the V spring, but it's some spring pressure is being put on a block that's pushing up against this the entire time we're using the revolver. When we are in a fired position, that block is actually sat in this middle valley, okay? This almost non-valley. And as we rotate back and forth, we come up against the edges of the ridge. And that's why we have a bias against counter-rotation and against over-rotation. We're just biased, though. If we actually, look at this, see this texturing here? That's a clue. If we actually push, we can overcome that valley. And now, or we can overcome that ridge. And now we are firmly in this deep, narrow valley. And in that deep, narrow valley, we are tightly held into alignment with the loading and unloading position. So we would load 1, right? And then push until thunk. Load 2, push until thunk, load 3. Once you got all 6 in there, you have to be conscious to kind of give it a quarter rotation, just a little bit. That puts you back into this soft gray area, at which point your gun will no longer lose its ammo. That is a very unusual system, and I think requires a little bit of extra intelligence from the shooter. To me, this habity is the ultimate evolution of the gate loading revolver. That's because it has a safety mechanism built in that also allows us to rapidly index the cylinder with a mechanical system. How? Well, it's a little hard to see, but there's a spud right here that is attached to the loading gate that you cannot see on the other side of the gun. I'm going to open the loading gate, which will cause this to rotate. It's going to turn into that nose. Watch what happens. See it coming around? And then, watch the nose. Ooh, it's getting compressed, and the hammer is being, look at that, rebounded backwards. And now it's blocked. We've blocked the hammer and compressed the nose, which means when we pull the trigger for double action fire, it's not going to pick up the hammer at all, but it is going to index the cylinder. See? No chance of firing the gun, and yet now we can move that cylinder very quickly and easily. That allows us to simply load, 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 or unload, unload, unload. It's hard to imagine a gate system getting much faster than that. Gate loading was a very popular option, especially for military arms, because it was simple and in most cases allowed for a continuous frame all the way around the cylinder. We have a complete top strap in this case. Solid frames are rugged and could be loaded with more powerful cartridges than, say, a two-piece gun. This 1868 Galland has a rapid ejection and somewhat rapid loading system. What we do is we just pull back on this little nubbin here, rock our trigger guard forward, that is a lot of stuff going on, and then, boom, all 6 rounds ejected by a plate. Being rimmed rounds, they'd just be popped right out of that cylinder. You do it forcefully enough and they scatter. If you do it slowly, you can keep them there and pluck them out carefully if you want to keep your brass. Now, from here, you kind of want to close this back up, lower the plate, and then start loading your 6 because the plate can get in your way if you load live ammo with it. Once you're there, you close her on back up, snaps 2, you're ready to rock and roll. That's a lot faster than any of the gate loading systems we've seen so far, very accessible. But it comes at a cost, and that cost is strength, because let me open this back up again so that you can see what's really going on in the construction of this gun. The front of the gun, the barrel, this whole assembly and armature, and the cylinder are all tied to the frame by just this central arbor. So we're going back to the same strength as very early percussion Colts. It's not a lot of strength at all. Yes, there's a key here, but it's not actually grasping anything. Theoretically, this latch is pulling on the lower trigger guard a bit, but whatever pull you're getting from that latch is probably being countermanded by the fact that we actually, in order to lock this up, we're braced against the central arbor in such a way that we are continuously yanking it out of the frame. Gently, it can take it, but it's still a net addition to come apart rather than hold together. So the entire gun's strength is just that central column and the strength of those either threads or cross pins that are holding it together. That means you have very limited potential for how powerful of a cartridge you can put in this gun. There's actually a similar system to the Galland in this Owens-Jones patent Enfield, which if I pull the lever, rather the latch lever right here at the top, and then bend the barrel down, ooh, we get a pop, and then, hey, we have a ejector star here that stayed with the frame and therefore kicked out all of our rounds. Now, you notice there's not as much room to work in here because this is designed just for ejection. You would pop it, maybe give it a little rotation so that it kicked out any that got stuck, and then you would snap it back shut. Because this one's designed to still be loaded through a traditional loading gate, which is right here. But when we look at this opened up, we can see that we do get a lot of extra strength coming from the Galland because, yeah, we have the central arbor strength, which is hinged, so it is a little compromised, but we have the strength added of having this hinged point here to hold on to the relationship between this front end and the frame. And then when we snap it shut, this guy's actually hooking into a lock mechanism here, so we're getting some yoke at the top. That means when we close it, there's some strength here, a good bit of strength here, and some strength down the middle. This is going to be a lot stronger than a Galland and can take a more powerful cartridge. This later Webley Mark VI also uses a hinge and a latch at the top, which uses a sort of square loop set over a lug to tie the top end together front to back. This is then clamped over top by a rotating latch. Let's take a look at what she does though. Oh, we pop all the way open, and something interesting is going to happen here because yes, there's our ejector star that we're used to. It's kicking out all of our spent casings like we want, but then something magic. It retracts automatically. And since the gun is now pointed proudly open like this, we have immediate access to all 6 cylinders, so we can rapidly reload the gun. That is a supreme improvement because we can kick them all out, get them right back in there, and then snap this guy closed, which is all cammed to allow you to just do. And then boom, you're in business. So this is a very classic top brake system coming over from an earlier Smith & Wesson patent. This is a very strong contender for some of the fastest reloading you can do. But again, it comes at the price of strength because in this system, your hinge is really holding the whole thing together. And then this top cap is resisting the rotational opening thereof, but it's not really giving you a lot of yoke. So this is a potentially weak system for higher pressure cartridges or one that will wear out over time. And these are the choices you have to make when you want to get, immediate access into the system and yet not sort of compromise on your ability to have a rigid frame. Thankfully, also in 1869, Augusto Albini would patent a way to have a wrap-around frame with a simultaneous ejection action and easy reloading. What he did was patent the swing-out cylinder. This Smith & Wesson triple lock does an excellent job of using that swing out cylinder concept. I can push forward on our latch, pop open our cylinder, and eject all of our rounds, load new ones, return it to the action. It gets its name triple lock because of the extreme measures it goes to make sure that not only does it have the strength of this rigid frame, but also perfect alignment of the cylinder. It uses 3 pins, one up front that then ties into the front of our ejector rod, one down below, which actually ties into the arm of the swing out cylinder, so right there on what would be called a crane. And then we have a third that is actually, let me see if I can show this to you. We have a third which is currently recessed back here at the center of the arbor that would then drive into the frame when this is closed. It's driven in by this guy up front popping on through. So when we close this up, we have the alignment guaranteed by 1 and 2 points each down the center. That's good. But then a third here that's actually working on the armature. So that way we don't have any of that flex that we saw as a risk from the earlier Colts. This gun is very hard to knock out of time, at least as far as the relationship between the cylinder and the frame. This K-frame has 2 pinpoints, a lock up front and a lock up at the rear down inside the frame. It's done away with the third. Now, I brought this guy out because I want to talk about something that goes back to our safety issue, which is that when you have, say, a top brake or swing out cylinder, anytime you have a mechanism that allows you to quickly open up this cylinder and then reintroduce it to the mechanism on some sort of swinging link or rotating piece at all. And there are other ways to do this, by the way. There are guns that just pivot and do all sorts of wild stuff. But every time you do that, as this comes back into alignment with the bore and is almost home but not quite there, we have the potential for a catastrophe, because at that point you now have a gun that previously was incapable of what you would call out-of-battery fire, having the cartridge go off without the action locked up and ready to fire, right? Now you could. So, if you're nearly aligned enough that a hammer could still reach the percussion element, then you could get a discharge without the cylinder aligned with the bore. You get shaving at best and, shattering at worst. So you need to have safety mechanisms that deal with this, which goes back to a previous topic, but has a lot more to do with loading in this case. Looking inside a K-frame, we can actually see how they prevent this. See this little lug right here? It's actually attached to a whole extension arm underneath the hammer, and to this guy right here, and all of it is attached to that lever that I was pressing in order to free the cylinder. That's on the outside back of the gun. So I push forward in order to compress the pin here that then releases this cylinder to drop. So this guy's getting pushed forward. It's all one piece, right? So I push forward, and when I open up my cylinder, watch what happens. It doesn't come back. This guy is not cammed back until the cylinder closes. The spring pressure of the pin inside the cylinder is what's driving it rearward. It's sprung to stay slightly forward on its own. In this forward position, look what we have. This goes all the way back to the Revolver almost. We have a hammer block that is sitting in the path of the hammer, so we cannot single or double action fire this gun if we're out of battery. Only at the moment that little tiny pin actually centers up and pokes its way inside the gun does this reset and we're allowed to fire it. So that completely prevents any chance of out of battery fire in this system. Now the Webley is fairly interesting because the cylinder is always with the barrel in terms of being parallel, but the actual rotation position is what you would be concerned about in terms of having a potential out of battery, right? And the reason we say out of battery and not just out of lock is because whenever we close this action, it's going to self-align to the correct position. See how it just turned itself? And that's the hand just settling down. That's the cylinder stop settling where it needs to be. The gun aligns when it is closed. And wherever we're at in the operation, if we were to have this hammer, all the way back single action, right? And I close this guy, he's going to align to that single action firing position. And as long as he's all the way down, he's doing his job. The trick is making sure he's all the way down. So what does this gun do? Well, while we're closing it, it cams this latch back, and the latch head is thick enough that it serves as a hammer rebound. See, it pushes up on that hammer just right so that we can't drop the hammer whatsoever until it's all the way home, at which point this snaps back over and we're free to strike. So there is your out of battery prevention on the Webley. Now, not every innovation in loading is integral to the revolver itself. Once you had top brakes and swing-out cylinders, that gave you complete access to the rear of the cylinder, and with a little imagination, it means you could pre-arrange your cartridges, usually 6 in number, so that they could be dropped in simultaneously. For the top brake, the most famous option is the Prideaux loader, as demonstrated here by my buddy. My usual show is about military firearms, so you don't often see commercial products from me, but in this case, I happen to have an exception. Don't forget, not all small arms innovations are military ones. It's just that we tend to see them applied militarily because that's what we focus on. In this case, I'm going to use a commercial revolver, another K-frame style of Smith & Wesson, to show you this 1930s development, the Revolver Cartridge Clip Corporation's Quick Loader. Try saying that 3 times fast. Now, if I pop open my cylinder, I can take this ringed in my finger, shove her on in, strip to the left. I'm trying to do this while keeping it somewhat in frame. And then all 6 are in. The gun is loaded with these obviously dummy snap caps, and this guy can be reloaded with more ammunition later. This is a handy quick loading system, one of many that work in a similar fashion. This Colt 1917 uses half moon clips, or technically it could use a full moon clip, but the half moons stay in your pocket a little flatter. So that allowed me to quickly load 3 rounds and 3 rounds held together, so 2 motions instead of 6. If I had a 6-round clip, it would have just been 1 big old motion, drop in nice and easy, and then the whole clip stays in the gun for the duration. This was also a way for Smith & Wesson and for Colt during World War I to be able to use rimless ammo inside of a revolver, which usually uses the rim to help with the ejector. In this case, the clips take care of the ejection. Now, those would have fallen 3 a lot closer, or a lot sooner, if it weren't for the fact that we have these mock bullets in these fake cartridges. Once more, same as all the other times before, this is not a complete list of loading and unloading mechanisms for revolvers. I've left you a whole world to discover. I would try and cover them all, but I wouldn't have time for the next category. The assembly category is an analysis of how the gun is put together, literally how it's assembled, or as most people are usually considering an already assembled revolver, the disassembly and then reassembly thereof. How the gun is literally put together doesn't just affect the factory worker. Revolvers require maintenance, most especially the barrel and the cylinder. Revolvers with terrible access to the cylinder are usually few in number 100 years later, as powder and fouling turn to rust and then rot. This was even more important, of course, in the black powder years. A lot of these early black powder revolvers, like the Colts, use a cross wedge block that holds the front end of the gun onto the arbor that runs through the center. For these, you just take a little mallet, usually plastic in the modern context, and give it a good thwack. And then you're able to pull that key out from the other side. And once you're all the way but not quite out of the gun because it is retained so it's not lost, you're able to either tap this lightly with a hammer, or you can use your rod to sort of diesel it apart, which a lot of people seem to prefer, and yet my guns are always tight enough that it feels like I'm just going to damage the arbor. So I like to still do my old tap and pull, which eventually gets it apart. Later designs might have a central floated arbor, which is retained by a cross screw or button of some sort, like this one here on a Colt Single Action Army reproduction. We just push in on this button here, that guy, and then we pull on this little arbor, and she comes right out, which is the central axis pin for our cylinder. And so, if we open the gate, she falls right on out. Now, on the Webley, the cylinder is actually technically just floating on that central arbor, so that it has a very slick presentation. It's like a bearing surface in there. There's nothing really holding it front or rear other than just its relationship in the frame. But since it's a top brake, something has to clamp it when we open it, which is actually the job of this particular guy here. It's a yoke that will index up and grab a ring on the cylinder when we're opening the gun. So if we take a look. Now, the reason it indexes up is because of this curved surface and this finger here. So if you'd like to remove the cylinder, you have to get this little indexing finger out of the way. And to do that, well, you have to unscrew it with this big old giant slotted screw that's designed really so I could put a quarter in there if I had to, or whatever unit of currency British people have. So you'd remove this guy. With this lovely little screw out, we can promptly lose that because we'll never find it again. And then with the action open, we can actually cam this in such a way that the yoke can drop. And with the yoke dropped, we're able to actually remove the cylinder. So not my favorite way, but at least you can get the cylinder out. Oof. The central arbor pin for our Nagant 1895 and many other revolvers is actually being held by, that swing away ejector rod that we saw earlier. So if we pull that out of our way, rotate it over to its full position for ejection, and we're still stuck. This tab, as small as it is still keeping the central arbor in place. So we have to make sure that we rotate it to just the right alignment, at which point, in this unlikely position to do accidentally, but very easy to do on purpose, we can pull the arbor out. As a matter of fact, there we go. I'm just right now. We can pull the arbor out. And once she's free, we can of course open our gate. And our cylinder is free to be removed. That's pretty handy. Now, if you're the sort of person who doesn't want to lose your little Webley screw or your Nagant arbor, you may consider the Dutch 1871 revolver, which uses a push-button flex spring in order to retain its central pin. At which point, let me see if I can... Oh, good lord. Okay, yeah, I had to take that to tummy time to get it done because this is very tight after 150 years of service. You see, we have a notch that interacted with what was the cleat here, and then we flex this button down to raise this cleat. Once we have this free, if we pull it on out the rest of the way, which is still, good lord, gentlemen, extremely stiff, especially at an odd angle, we get to the end, and our cylinder is now free. If I open up the gate, she's going to fall away, but thanks to this screw at the rear, our arbor is still being held in place. It's not going anywhere. So we just have the cylinder and the entire rest of the gun to deal with. Now, one of the benefits of the swing out cylinder is that you don't actually really need a takedown system for your cylinder, because when you open it up, you have free access to the cylinder and to the barrel as if it had been removed from the gun. So in this system, there's nothing to lose and there's no real extra work to do. I bet you know that I'm going to say that this is not an exhaustive list of all the ways to remove a cylinder from a revolver. You get it. Let's keep going, because there is a lot more to disassembly than just the cylinders, obviously. For military revolvers in particular, it can be important to have access to the interior lockwork for cleaning, oiling, or quickly making repairs. But this access has a consequence, like so many of the other decisions we've seen today. It affects both the strength of the gun and especially the expense that goes into making it. Now, the original Patterson was actually a series of parts basically screwed together. You have a frame of sorts with everything piled into and onto it, including, by the way, this block, which was separate because of the round cut necessary. It was better to just go ahead and make it as a separate piece and then attach it with a single screw to the frame. Of course, getting into it requires playing with a bunch of little fiddly bits, and the deeper you go, the more fiddly bits you end up with. Both this Gasser and this Webley are what I would consider to be fixed frame, hollow-bodied revolvers. In other words, the frame of these guns is one integral piece, kind of like the Colt was, but they extend even further down into the grips, even further forward in a lot of cases, although both of these are kind of roughly cut in half because of the way they're assembled. But you get the idea. There's no door or gate or hole to work through other than what you get through the grip panels, and it makes them very difficult to work with. The problem with fixed frames is, well, usually you can remove the grip panel, that's good, but from there, you gotta fish around to get things in and out. So you'll take out these screws, that'll set your trigger loose and your hammer loose, and then you gotta fish them in and out of the mechanism and all the various parts. And then when you wanna put it back together, you have to get them aligned and set, and then the spring tension set, all working through a little hole, kind of like a ship in the bottle. Not a great way to be able to work on a gun. So something like this Webley that's a little bit out of time thanks to the way the hand is set up in it. For me, with a side plate gun, I could go in there, get it out, get it worked on, get it back in, see if that works. If it didn't work, pull it in and out a few more times and just keep trying to get the alignment. On this gun, it's now going to cost me 15 or 20 minutes every time I want to get that hand out and back in if I'm really fast. And so it's going to take a lot longer to fix a little timing issue like that. Some revolvers, like this Colt 1878, are pseudo fixed frames. They have inspection windows like this round hole, or the entire bottom plate comes out so you have a much easier time fishing around in there. This is a big improvement over a regular fixed frame, and yet it can be hard to get in and out of and see what's going on, obviously. The problem with a system like this is that this pin, in this case, or screw rather, because it is threaded, is supporting the hammer, right? The hammer rotates around it. And we can even rotate the hammer with it open, which is kind of a no-no. Watch that flex. See how it's coming out of center? That's because this really is quite literally a screw on this gun. It's not even attached to the frame. It actually goes through to the other side. And if you're curious, by the way, this one's set up for reverse threading, which means that we righty-loosey, and the reason for that is because recoil would be over the top, and therefore they want it to tighten when it travels to the left. That's pretty cool. But back to what we're really talking about, which is the fact that we have an inspection window, and we have to very carefully support both sides of this particular central axis pin in this case. Yes, it's threaded in as a screw, but as far as the hammer is concerned, this is a smooth pin that it's riding on. And we want both sides to be perfectly in a line so that it doesn't mess with the timing of the system or put unnecessary strain on the gun. And so we have to perfectly support it. The way Colt has done this is they have a circle. And a circle is a very easy hole to cut with a machine that's going to be accurate every time. As a matter of fact, they probably center that cut on the drill hole through the other side so that this is always in perfect alignment. Now, of course, the plate itself has to have some cutaway in order to allow the hand to move but still provide support elsewhere, and therefore this must go in a very specific way. And they actually have it indexed with, and this is probably just a bit blurry, but there's a pin here that then aligns over here. You get the idea. This is actually more complicated than it seems, but very important for the support. While I'm talking about as well, it's not just a circle, it's a circle with a step. See the step down in there? And that step is again critical in making sure that this piece goes in perfectly centered so that the alignment is dead on. There's a lot of mechanical consideration to getting this just right. Most of the guns we've seen today are like this Chamelot, although in this case we've got a loose screw. We'll just lose that. And then the side plate comes off, woo, and the grip pops on out of there, and we are in. Now that side plate system was actually an invention. It came around in 1870 by Paul Gunther and Jacques Latouche, and what they patented really wasn't the idea of a side plate necessarily, but rather that you could remove essentially half of the outer skin of a revolver and leave all the components still pinned in place such that they work. Like right now, as you've seen through this whole episode, we can operate the action and properly inspect it and see how it works and really get an idea of what's going on in here, which is super critical for maintenance. And yet, the gun is apart. Now you can't shoot it this way because again, like I said before, these pins are unsupported on one side. As a matter of fact, you really shouldn't dry fire this very heavily like this either because you're likely to torque on these pins. I've actually seen at least one, actually weirdly again, a Nagant 1895, in which someone had been working it with the side plate off, and then this central pin for the hammer managed to crack at its base because over time, it just started walking further and further out of the corners. Like you're actually not really doing this gun any favors using it with the side plate off. So don't make an special habit out of it. Just use it when you need to see what's going on and when you need to service the revolver. Or like me, you're displaying it to a bunch of people so they understand what's going on. Now, the advantage of this is very clear. We see what's happening. The disadvantage, like I said, is the pins from a fixed frame are not as well supported unless you get this plate exactly perfect. In a fixed frame gun, you jig up the frame, you drill through the whole thing, and then you go back and thread the side you need to thread. On a gun like this, you have to make this separate piece plate. You have to fit it perfectly to the frame, and then you would probably jig it up and drill your holes to make sure they're straight. But this fit of this, complex shape has to be absolutely perfect, or you are going to start to get unnecessary wear and unsupported corners of your pins that are going to get slightly askew, ruin your timing, possibly ruin other issues, and then the gun's going to wear apart very quickly. It'll shake itself to death, essentially. So, while the side plate is excellent, it represents an extreme increase in machine time and cost, and the sort of skill that you need to make the gun. Now, these Smith & Wesson K-frame side plates are my least favorite on the planet. I have to remove 1, 2, 3, 4 of these little tiny screws that I am definitely going to lose one day. I got to keep a lot of magnets around. This is not field serviceable. And I usually have to go ahead and remove this 5th one because I got to get these side plates off in order to have somewhere to pry to get this open. Now, a lot of you are going to say, don't pry, tap, right? So once it's loosed, you just bang on it with something like a rubber handle or a wooden mallet, and it'll start to shake loose. But a lot of these guns, they get dirty, they get rusted, and so people start looking for places to dig at them, usually in through here, which pops one side, and then you can kind of get in on the trigger and carefully pop the other. And the whole time you're being extremely delicate because you don't want to chew up the edge here, which is extremely sharp with no relief in it whatsoever. And then finally, thunk, it pops out, because these are, credit to Smith & Wesson, perfectly fitted every time. I mean, they are monumentally good at fitting these pieces, so much so that I hate taking them out. Then, if we flip her over, we'll see that instead of having screws through or anything like that, these all have little bores that don't go all the way through and support the other side of the various pins and operations in this gun, just like the ones where we did see the pins go all the way through. The Reich's revolver also has a fully screwed in side plate. We have to remove 3 screws in order to get it out. But look what they've done for us. They've left a notch here, which is such that we could take our screwdriver tip, get it in there, and pry. They've also left a notch down on the other side in front of the trigger guard, and one at the rear, again giving us options to pry the plate up without tearing up the gun. Now contrast all of that with our Abadie, which has no screws to be removed, and instead we flex back on this trigger guard, which I've already pre-popped a little bit for the sake of expediency on camera, and then we swing it down. And I want you to pay close attention to the front end of this plate, because not only do we not have to remove any screws, but our gun is camming the plate open for us. It's through this lever mechanism, we are actually lifting the front of the plate, and the rear of the plate is partially hinged, so it'll just sweep on open. And we have a little sort of rotating claw at the rear that catches at the corner, and we can see where we have a planed surface here on a diagonal, and this pin which rides in it and therefore pops the plate. When we want to put her back together, we just put our plate down, rotate it back, she drops in, and then we just flex forward and click, which again, easier to do when you're not trying to do it 3 feet away from you for the camera. There we go. And boom, we're done. This Japanese Type 26 works somewhat similarly, but has one added advantage. So I'm going to press forward on my trigger guard and then cam it down. So that's like one big old spring that I have to compress once she's popped. We don't get any camming action, but we do have a little spot where we can put our fingernail in or a screwdriver tip if we needed to. It's actually checkered right here so that we get a good grip. Then we flip this guy over, and we have a permanent hinge. This side plate never gets lost. The grip, however, you're on your own to make sure you don't lose that. But it's a fairly big piece of wood to keep track of versus all the little bits and bobs that we've had to deal with so far. So this is a really handy little access plate. All right, we are starting to near the end of our long journey. And for those of you who have stuck it out this far, I have a little treat. It just so happens to be one of my favorite little secret revolvers, and I'm trying to get some ammunition and more of its martial history ironed out before I can do a proper episode. But one of its best features is its method for disassembly. There are so many wonderful things in the big wide world of firearms history. All right, what's the last point in our topic today? Oh yeah, feel. I should probably just call this ergonomics. It would seem more official, but it would also sort of ruin my mnemonic device. And it lacks that emotive human element. Small arms, the sort of firearms that we actually carry around, particularly pistols, are meant to work on a sort of symbiosis with human beings. They should conform to us, to work with our biology and shape. The hand right here. And they need to be fairly adaptable to a variety of humans with different fingers and palms, and maybe eyesight and lengths of their arms. Let's dig in. Here's that Patterson again, one of the earliest revolvers and the father of basically all the modern designs. It has a sort of plow handle grip with a little bit of a flare to it, which actually works out fairly well, especially because it's a single action only gun that requires us to cock the hammer frequently. That means we can get some utility out of this curved back. It can help us move our way up and back down the gun. Slidey bit. Yeah, okay, I see. It's definitely scratching me a bit, but it works. So the idea is that we may even be able to inertia the gun open. Not quite all the way there. I'm definitely having some problems due to a missing element here. That folded trigger and no trigger guard makes the cocking of the hammer a little bit weird. Now, this much later centerfire Bodeo is a single and double action revolver that still has a folding trigger. It's done for safety because when it's in the holster, then if you go to draw the gun in a panic, you can't accidentally grab or death grip the trigger on the draw, which is when you would shoot yourself in the leg. Instead, you have to present the weapon, at which point, if this mechanism is loose, gravity will just drop this trigger for you, or if it's snug like it's supposed to be, then it won't fall free until you touch the hammer just a bit. And then you are very consciously engaging your trigger. You know what you are doing, and you are probably not pointing it in the wrong direction. The problem again with this though, is that with no sort of trigger guard, it is still very awkward to cock the hammer for single action fire. This Rice revolver does have a trigger guard, and it kinda helps with being able to bear between my thumb and my middle finger when cocking the hammer, which is pretty cool, but this grip is awfully big, and I'm having to scooch up and down its massive length whenever I try to use anything on the gun or get back into the position of firing it. And that curve is sort of formless. It's not really helping me grip or point very much at all. This much older Walker revolver is actually a little bit better because of its somewhat tighter curve on the grip, tucking in at the pinky, giving me a big bell, and then a little radius there for my middle finger up in that grip so that I can get in there and work that hammer and yet still be pretty close to home when I go to pull the trigger. Not as much scooching, and yet it's still not giving me much definition back here, probably again because of its single action only nature in which we're going to be rocking the gun. This Colt 1878 grip is a really strong departure from what we've seen before. It's narrow and deeply contoured to fit into the human hand. It's got a round butt at the tail and a big flick to the pinky, and most notably, a very steep knuckle here at the rear. That engages the webbing of my hand so that I'm nice and anchored for that double action pull. And on this gun, it's quite severe, so I'm very thankful for it. Now, this has its own disadvantages in terms of overall strength and narrowness in here, and potentially what sort of grip position you have when you're shooting. You notice it's not very aggressive at the tail, so this probably has a slight curvature of the wrist assumed whenever you're shooting. While I have this gun out, notice the very large trigger guard, because the expectation is not just a regular finger like mine, but a big fat finger or maybe a gloved hand may use this gun. And these trigger guards can get even bigger depending on if they're a service piece or a civilian one. And you'll see that across a lot of the revolvers. Now, the disadvantage to something being overtly large is it's more likely to get banged up, damaged, or hard to fit into a holster. So there's always a compromise decision being made. All right, now the Galland is pretty neat. We have a nice tapered, very long grip, tapered up to the front. It bells just a bit. The contours are very pleasant. We have an extremely deep and softly contoured knuckle, and then a nice big old flat top. So when I get a hold of this, it feels very good, except if I'm trying to grip with all my fingers on the grip, you'll see I'm a little crowded in here because it is so narrow, which would have been a problem on that 78 Colt as well. So the solution here, we go ahead and put an extension off the trigger guard. That trigger spur is a position for my middle finger, and so it opens up my grip very widely. So now I'm able to grip between my webbing and my middle finger and then support with my other two fingers. And that gives me a lot of extra, let's say a little torque, right? In terms of pulling the gun back to center. So if I fire and recoil and I want to bring her down, I have more leverage being provided to either reset or resist that over the top motion because I've been able to extend my middle finger further out. It looks fairly awkward as we're doing it here, but honestly, it feels pretty nice. I'm a big fan of these trigger spurs. I'm not even going to get into things like the Bisley grips and other shapes that were designed for a particular type of shooting that was popular at one time or another. How you hold the gun, tucked, full extension, single hand, two-handed, these things dictate which grip is best at that posture. And speaking of grip, if you should happen to lose yours, that's why we have the lanyard ring. On revolvers, they're almost always at the butt here, although on rare occasions I'll see them up at the knuckle. But the idea is that you have this loop hanging on down that you can tether to either your holster or directly to your belt. That way, if you drop the gun, it is not completely separated from you, lost to the wilderness. You just have to grab for your belt line, find the cord, and pull it back to yourself. Now, the core function of a firearm is to deliver a bullet over a distance to a predetermined point. How do you pick that point? Well, you do it with the sights. This we could spend all day on, as the options are numerous and varied. However, for pistols, they are generally expected to work at arm's length, so go big, right? And yet, for military use, they need to be rugged, so go super bulky. But then we add weight, and we might snag on the holster when we draw, so go low profile? Honestly, most early Marshall revolvers barely had sights at all because short-range point shooting was the expectation. Yeah, sights are extremely varied, and there's even commercial applications in which you have scoped revolvers, or nowadays you'll get rails with red dots. There's so many different ways to make sure that you're aligned on this gun. But generally, it's rear sight, front sight for the guns that we talk about. Now, next up, let's talk about the efficient use of human muscle. This Reichs revolver, the 1879, is infamous for its extremely heavy hammer spring. Oh man, that is steep. And then it comes crashing down. And the reason for that is because of the very hard military primers of the day. But that's only one half of the equation, right? We need the spring to be hard enough to really wallop those centerfire primers. But at the end of the day, you also have to have a human thumb operating this over and over and over again. And so you can only ramp up that pressure so much before it becomes unusable. And every time you ramp up that pressure, you're adding that much more fatigue to someone trying to use it, that much more difficulty to someone who may have blood-covered hands trying to work it. There's all sorts of incidents in which you would rather this be easier to use rather than harder. Weight is especially important when we're talking about the trigger, especially in double actions like this Colt, which is actually notorious for being a heavy double action pull. That's because of usually a poor arrangement of the parts, too many surface interactions in those parts, or too heavy of a spring. There's other ways to mess it up as well. Just having the trigger out of line with the hand will make things worse. Those sorts of problems. Now, the issue with having such a heavy trigger pull is actually more down in here, which you can see my arm flex a bit as I pull the trigger because your finger is at the end of a muscular system. It is integrated into your body. And the more flex and strength you try putting into the finger, the more you're going to start having unexpected results in your arm. And yes, you can train away from that, but the less force you make the finger use, the less people have to struggle to train out of twisting unconsciously while pulling that trigger. So, in other words, a heavy trigger pull means poorer accuracy on average for most people, and makes it harder to shoot the gun and more exhausting to use the gun overall. You'd really rather avoid it. However, the weight of a double action trigger pull is often considered a safety device in and onto itself. If a double action was too light, you might negligently discharge the pistol. Heavy means deliberate, so you have to find a balance. Our Colt Walker was designed to be heavy, and it shows. This is a massive handgun, gigantic in length, gigantic in weight, and not quite everything they hoped it would be, let's be honest. So, why was it done this way? They wanted a large black powder charge, a large bore coming off the Patterson. And the extra weight was thought to be acceptable because it was not being carried on the hip, it was being carried on the saddles. The horse carried it around, not the man. And then once you had to draw and point, they felt that as you're bobbing around on a horse, the heavy mass would actually keep it sort of inertially stabilized, which is not untrue to some degree. The problem is, at the end of the day, it's still at the end of a human arm, and then well past the end of the human hand, and all that extra mass at the front is really going to start to exhaust you. And so you're only going to get so many aimed, well-placed shots at a time. One advantage of this length, though, is the sight radius. In this case, it is extremely long for a handgun because our front sight is here, and our rear sight is actually in the hammer. Now, that massive distance means that, let's say we're 3 degrees off in our aim. We'll be able to see that 3 degrees as a more obvious distance between the front and rear sight when reading, let's say, laterally between them. If these were closer together, you might not notice that 3 degree shift, and therefore you'll be 3 degrees further off in your aim. So a long sight radius can be a great boon to accuracy. At the opposite end of the spectrum from that Walker is this 2-inch barrel Smith & Wesson K-frame. Now the frame is a medium frame, and in this case it has a nice big bell housing, so this one is still not even like a rounded but sort of more concealable shape, right? The grip gets in on this action too. But we still have the 2-inch barrel, and that's mostly done for concealability, although there is another advantage, which is that assuming we're in a holster and we start to draw, then this gun's going to clear the holster at this point versus a 6-inch barrel that would clear it further down like this. So it's a little faster on the draw, and you can hide it in different places. If you want to get it really slicked up, round the back end, maybe bob the hammer so it's double action only, and then it's less likely to snag and things like that. This piece though, somebody compromised. They wanted short and concealable, but they also wanted the target grips. Now, what are the deficiencies? Well, on the precision side of things, we have a shorter barrel, which means lower muzzle velocity because we're blowing more unburnt powder out. We're not getting as much time to have on that bullet to really impart the spin we want. And so on the precision side, at 100 yards, this is going to have a more open group if, viced in and held perfectly still than a 6-inch barrel of the same gun. On the accuracy side, on the part that is the human element aiming and getting what they're trying to get, we have a very short sight radius, and that sight radius means that we're going to be less likely to pick up on variations of significantly being off on our aim. So this gun is designed to be tucked away and then used quickly at short range versus the Walker's long range capabilities. Most European martial revolvers of the 1870s, the early double actions, would tend to be roughly this frame size and fairly large, moderately heavy, and usually with a bullet between 9.4, like in this case, this is on the smaller end, or up to 11mm. These guns are generally a bit muzzle heavy, which helps resist the climb and helps with reset when shooting, especially single-handed as they did at the time. But with the advent of small bore, high velocity jacketed projectiles and smokeless powder, you start to see things like this. This being a Norwegian adopted 7.5mm Nagant revolver with the exact same mechanism as this Belgian 86, just scaled down by a smidge, maybe 5%, 7% overall. I mean, unless you're really paying attention, it's hard to tell that they actually are quite a different size, but once you lay your hands on it, this guy feels a lot lighter, narrower, and easier to control. This is a much better gun to have on your holster. Now we're starting to bump into the notion that ergonomics take up a lot of room in revolver cartridge selection. If scaled and strengthened appropriately, wheel guns can theoretically chamber just about anything that you could put through a gun. Bulking up a revolver for more cartridges in terms of count, 6, 7, 8, 9, right? Or more powerful cartridges, or larger diameter cartridges may be more desirable in a military context. However, the human body represents a limitation. Too big, too heavy of a gun, and it's difficult to carry around with you. Again, too heavy and unbalanced, and it's difficult or even impossible to aim effectively. And then even your best Uber cartridge can't be delivered adequately onto the enemy. So we generally see our service cartridges in a band of about 8 to 12 millimeters. Interestingly, the measure of the effectiveness of these bullets is also a measure of their interaction with the human body. It's just a bit more gruesome and unwanted feeling. I don't have any photos for y'all on that topic, and I want to keep broadcasting the show, so I'm going to duck out by just saying that the effects of the bullets are an ergonomic decision too. They just play with the human body at higher speed. Now, the powder load that they put behind those bullets isn't just limited by the strength of the gun. We can certainly make some very strong but otherwise very light actions. Severe enough recoil, though, will start to beat up on the shooter to a degree that is unnecessary, resulting in fatigue, wariness of the weapon itself, or even, in smaller doses still, poor follow-up time between their shots. Another interesting consideration towards recoil is bore axis. That's the height of the barrel above your hand. The lower it is, the less leverage the revolver has available to put into rotating your hand when firing. This Dutch 1871 has a remarkably high bore axis, and despite its mild cartridge, I can't wait to try out shooting a revolver where the barrel is 1.5 inches above my finger. This is going to be wild. Most revolvers these days fall somewhere in the range of this K-frame, which is actually, not too terrible. It's still pretty close to the top of my hand, and yet, even with all that, revolvers today are still known to be a little bit flippy because of that overhand action that it produces from having the bore set above your finger. Semi-automatic pistols tend to have the advantage in terms of being able to keep their barrels down. However, some revolvers are even underbored, lowering the barrel as much as possible to improve recoil and speed follow-up. There's always an exception. You might also find things like this, a stocked revolver meant to provide not just 1 or 2 points of contact, but a third one, allowing for more accurate shooting, maybe even at range. There are also obviously dedicated revolving rifles and shotguns, but those are not really our focus for today. Long story short, the feel category, or ergonomics, is a nearly bottomless pit. Every possible way you interact with the revolver has a consideration towards your human bits. The latch on the loading gate, how much a button for removing the arbor sticks out, such that you can press it easily but not knock it loose in a holster. Crucial little details ad nauseum. Heck, here's something I forgot to mention the entire episode, but it again goes into our feel or ergonomics section, which is that what's going on with some of these revolvers being perfectly smooth on the cylinder wall versus others who have deep scallops or fluting that seem to correspond with in between each of the chambers. What's going on there is that we're actually trying to get as much weight off the gun as we can without compromising its strength, and so taking little bites from in between the chamber positions as much as you dare without ruining the strength of the revolver, and in rounded shapes that hopefully help keep from compromising the strength between the chambers, ultimately ends up with a lighter product. And so you can get a few ounces off depending on the size of your gun, so why not take the extra time and complication to mill these? Or if the weight doesn't matter to you that much, or if you need the extra strength no matter what, then you can skip this part. All right, folks, even after all that, there are so many other features we could have covered, and I'll be the first to admit that I probably will have to amend my little list of categories due to some glaring defect I missed. But the point of this exercise wasn't to say I'm the king of revolver knowledge. On the contrary, while making this show, I realized how little I knew and how little I still know. So I thought I'd invite you all into my little well of curiosity, gift out many of the interesting little tidbits that I'd spotted, and promise to be a better researcher going forward. Now, let's drive a little engagement on this topic. With everything that you've learned from this video so far, what revolver would you either adopt Or what combination of features would you combine to invent one for yourself? Well, while you type all that one up, I hope you have a good one.
If you've enjoyed this discussion, consider watching one of our many in-depth episodes. If you're already a fan, consider supporting the education of others by helping us on Patreon, Subscribestar, or Utreon. And finally, you can get patches, posters, and even shirts at C&Rsenal.com. Have a good one, y'all.